Thank you very much. My name is Scott Edwards. I'm the chair this year of the Stephen J. Gould Prize Committee. The Stephen J. Gould Prize is awarded annually by the Society for the Study of Evolution to recognize individuals whose sustained and exemplary efforts have advanced public understanding of evolutionary science and its importance in biology, education, and everyday life in the spirit of Stephen J. Gould. The selection committee this year consisted of myself, Sam Shiner, Hopi Hoekstra, John Willis, and Maria Servideo, and usually consists of a mix of the SSE Education Committee as well as the SSE Council. The winner of the 2011 Stephen J. Gould Prize is Kenneth R. Miller, Professor of Biology at Brown University. Through his writings, teachings, and appearances in court, Dr. Miller has proved an eloquent and passionate defender of evolution and the scientific method. Dr. Miller received his PhD in biology from the University of Colorado and taught from 1974 to 1980 at Harvard University, where he met and got to know Stephen Gould very well. His passion and skill at rebutting the claims of creationists eventually led him to serve as a key witness in several important high-profile evolution creationist court cases, including the well-known Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District case in 2005. The decision for that case effectively forestalled further attempts to mandate the teaching of intelligent design in high school science curricula. Dr. Miller is also well known for his widely used and evolution-themed high school biology textbook named Biology, co-authored with Joseph Levine. This book was at the heart of additional court cases in 2004 and 2005. Dr. Miller has written insightfully about the relationships between science and religion in his 1999 book, Finding Darwin's God, and his most recent book, Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, which came out in 2008 and was named to Amazon's list of best science books of 2008, and additionally was a finalist for the National Academy of Sciences Communication Award in 2009. So it's my great pleasure to present Dr. Miller with a plaque, as well as a check for his winning the Stephen J. Gould Prize for 2011. Please give Dr. Miller a big hand.
Scott, thank you very much. This is an extraordinary thing, and it's an extraordinary honor. I'm very, very grateful to this society and the selection committee, of course, for this award, and especially for the opportunity to spend a few minutes speaking to you today. I'm aware of the fact that this award is relatively new, and I feel myself especially privileged to join the small company of previous recipients, and these include the extraordinary Eugenie Scott and the stellar Sean Carroll, and I find myself humbled to be in such absolutely amazing company. I'm also taken by the fact that this award is named for the late Stephen J. Gould. This is how I remember Steve about the time that I left Harvard, a smiling New York wise guy on the cover of magazines. And in the year 1981, which you'll see is an important year for me, I was privileged to host Steve when he came down to Brown University to lecture. And what I didn't realize that he would bring 3 photographers in tow. He had just been named Scientist of the Year by Discover Magazine, and he ended up with his photograph in my office and the inaccurate subtitle saying Gould and biochemist Kenneth discussing anti-creationist strategy. That was a rather interesting thing. I was asked by one of the organizers last night if I could share an anecdote about Steve Gould, and from one of these visits down to our campus is really what the best anecdote I can think of, that gives you some insight into his character. In the late 1980s, I and several other faculty arranged to have a conference on evolution of biology teachers in New England. We drew about 250 high school biology teachers from around the New England area. We had 2 members of our faculty speak at it. We also had Jonathan Weiner, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Beak of the Finch. He turns out to be a Providence boy, and one of the teachers on the organizing committee had actually taught him in high school. And the people asked me, you said you actually know Gould. Could you get Gould to come? And I said, well, I know him. I'm not sure he'll come. So I called Steve in his New York office. He'd given me his secret phone number for his office in New York, the hard thing to get. And I asked him about this, and at the time, his lecture fee was in excess of $10,000. And I said, we have scraped everything we could get, and all I can give you is $500 and a train ticket. And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, how many teachers are going to be there? And I said, more than 200. And then out loud, he did the math. And when he did the math, he said, they all teach about 100 kids. That means I'm going to be speaking to 20,000 science students if I speak to these teachers. And he said, I'm coming. A day later, to make arrangements, I called him back, again, just for the $500. And I said, you've written so many books, I'm going to have the bookstore set up a table of your books so that when the teachers purchase them, you can autograph them. And suddenly he got angry. And he said, I want to make this clear, Ken. If you set up a table of my books for sale, I'm not coming. I don't want anyone to think that I'm coming to sell books. I'm coming to speak to teachers. And naturally, we agreed to his wishes. And then he came down, and teachers themselves often brought books, and he generously autographed them, so he's not refusing to do that. But he didn't want anybody to think that his reason for coming there was commercial, which is something that I found extraordinary. Now, those of you who follow the scientific news in just the last week know very well that Steve has come in for a little criticism. And in particular, there's a paper that argues that many of the measurements that he used in his extraordinary book, The Mismeasure of Man, were in fact incorrect. I should let you know that this is not the first time that Steve Gould has received some stack, although in this case post-mortem. He was criticized frequently during his lifetime, and in the very article in which I showed that snapshot, as it turns out, there were many other evolutionary biologists who were quoted criticizing the nature of his work, his flair for publicity, and so forth. And many evolutionary theoreticians have taken issue with the idea of punctuated equilibrium, among other things. But this is not the reason that we remember Stephen Jay Gould. We do not remember him for his groundbreaking studies on snail evolution or other things. We remember him rather because he was one of the few scientists we can think of worthy of a caricature in the New York Review of Books. And that caricature reflects his extraordinary contributions to public discourse and the public understanding of science. And when you read Gould's essays, you see someone brimming over with enthusiasm, not just for evolutionary biology, but for science, for learning, and for life itself. Just about 10 years ago, PBS put on an extraordinary 8-hour series on evolution. Who did they seek to capture the essence of evolutionary biology? The answer is none other than Stephen Jay Gould. When Rose wanted to talk to somebody about evolution, who do you ask? Stephen Jay Gould. When CBS Sunday Morning wanted someone to capture the struggle between evolution and so-called alternative theories, who do they ask? Stephen Jay Gould. And last, and certainly not least, as you all know, when Lisa Simpson needed an authority on geoengineering, she asked for Stephen Jay Gould. Well, those of you who know anything at all about my background, there might not be too many of you, I'm sure, know that I'm actually not an evolutionary biologist. I'm a cell biologist. And my main research tool is the electron microscope. I study the organization of biological membranes, and these are the sorts of journals I usually publish in. These are a couple of cover images from work in these journals that have come out of my laboratory. So how did a nice cell biologist who spends his days in a dark room with an electron microscope get interested in evolution? The answer is, in my very first year at teaching at Brown University, a group of students came to me with a challenge. This was almost exactly 30 years ago. And they told me that they were sponsoring a speech on campus by Henry Morris, the director of the Institute for Creation, research, the real father of scientific creationism in America, and they wanted to know if I would debate him. And at first I said no, and they said, why not? I said, because I don't know anything about evolution. And they persisted and said, well, does that mean he's right? And I said, of course he's not right. Evolution is a vigorous field. And I said, well, I tell you what, I'll consider this, but only under the condition that you give me some information about this. I have to see where this guy is coming from. So they gave me a series of books. This was one. I listened to some audio tapes of Morris debating Ashley Montague at Princeton, and incidentally tearing Ashley Montague apart, which absolutely terrified me. But I decided I would go ahead and do this. And what I didn't anticipate were the times, what else was happening in the country, and how effective these students were at publicity. They peppered the campus and the area around here with extraordinary posters like this. They sold tickets, and to my absolute amazement, the night before, they told me they had to move the debate from a lecture hall on campus to the single largest room at our university because they had sold 1,800 tickets. What room is that, you might ask? It's the ice hockey rink. Debate. Now, I was so scared at this point, and the evolutionary biology section of my university summoned me to lunch the week before the debate. And they asked me, what do you think you're doing, man? These people always do these debates. You're going to bring discredit upon yourself and this university, and when you come up for tenure in a couple of years, we'll remember this. So that, of course, put literally the fear of God into me. And these are actually some photocopies, which I still have, of the nearly 150 35 millimeter slides and my notes that I prepared for that debate so that I would be ready to go and ready for any contingency. Now, as it turns out, the debate from my point of view went pretty well, and I ended up doing another one in Tampa, Florida that fall. In those two debates, in toto, more than 3,000 people came. And you might wonder, here's some newspaper clippings from these two debates, you might wonder, why would 3,000 people, more than 3,000, come to a couple of debates on this issue? And would that happen today? I'm not sure what happened today. But in 1981, two American states, Arkansas and Louisiana, had passed laws requiring the teaching of creation science in schools throughout the state. And quite frankly, what a lot of people wanted to see was, is this the coming thing? Is there something to this creation science business? Well, as it turns out, towards the end of that very same year, a trial in federal court took place in Arkansas on the Arkansas law. One of the star witnesses of that trial was, of course, Stephen J. Gould. And Gould's testimony was enormously persuasive to the judge. And you may recognize, if you know the history of these debates, you may recognize a couple of other characters over here as well. Well, Gould's testimony was enormously effective. It shows up in the final opinion, and the judge simply struck down the Arkansas creationism law. A couple of years later, the Louisiana law found its way to the United States Supreme Court, which struck that law down as well. So I might be tempted to say, in the early 1980s, after a few debates with Henry Morris and the infamous Duane Gish as well, that the battle was over. I certainly thought so I figured I could retire as a creationist debater. And in the meantime, a former student of mine named Joe Levine called me up on the phone with an absolutely insane idea, which is that the two of us should get together and write a high school biology textbook. At first I said no, and gradually Joe talked me into it. As anyone who's ever written a textbook can tell you, we did this lickety-split. It's just a matter of 8 years between his insistence and our first publication. So Joe and I went merrily on. Our first book was successful. We wrote a number of sequels, and we have a new book which has just come out this year. I had the pleasure, I'm not sure it's the pleasure, of seeing the specter of one of my own daughters educated using this book. She is the daughter, by the way, of today of whom I do not speak, because she became a history teacher rather than a biologist. But nonetheless, if I had thought this was over in the 1980s, when Joe and I began to publish these books, we suddenly discovered it's not over. And as an example of that, in one county in Georgia, the second largest county, this disclaimer was attached to the cover of all of our textbooks. This textbook has material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. And I still remember when that sticker went on our books, I was called up by a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And she asked me, literally, Professor Miller, aren't you outraged that they put these warning labels on your books? Now, I had been interviewed before at that point, but I never had a reporter invite me to use a word like outrage. And I realized that she was trolling for a nice inflammatory quote, so she could write an article with a headline that says, author incensed, or better yet, northern author irritated, all this sort of stuff. So I decided I wouldn't give her the pleasure, and I said, well, I actually like the stickers. She said, you do? And I said, yeah, but they don't go far enough. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know that last sentence where it says, this material, that means evolution, should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered? I said, I don't like that one at all. And she said, why not? And I said, she said, is it because it reflects doubt about evolution? And I said, oh, no, not at all. It's because it reflects certainty about everything else in biology. And I said, I'm an experimental cell biologist. And when you say that only evolution has to be approached with an open mind, it means you don't need that to learn biochemistry. And when it says only evolution has to be studied carefully, it means biochemistry, no problem. And when it says you have to critically consider evolution, what does that mean about ecology? And I said the real third sentence should read, everything in science should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully and critically considered. And I put that sticker on the book myself. Alas, the good people in Cobb County did not take me up on my offer to rewrite the sticker. They were sued by this gentleman, Jeffrey Selman, who in my view is a real hero. There was a federal trial on these. I testified in this trial, first time I'd ever been in court as a witness. It was an interesting thing. The stickers had to come out. It was written up in newspapers all over the country. And now I figured, so now the battle is over, and everything's going to be okay. But at almost the same time as this trial, another battle was brewing over evolution and something called intelligent design in the very small town of Dover, Pennsylvania. This is the science department of Dover Area High School. And confronted with the school board's insistence that they prepare a statement on intelligent design, the teachers refused. Think of the horror of this. The school board then wrote their own lesson on intelligent design and asked the teachers to read it to the students. The teachers, at the risk of being fired, these are three courageous people, at the risk of being fired, they refused to read that statement. So the school board was reduced to sending the superintendent and the assistant superintendent into the classroom to read this statement to the students while the teachers literally stood outside in the hallway. The next day, 11 parents went down to federal court in Harrisburg, and they filed this First Amendment lawsuit, arguing that this was inherently a religious idea, and therefore was a violation of their First Amendment rights as Americans. Some of you may have followed this case as it unfolded. The trial lasted for 7 weeks. It was widely covered in the press and media, and a few years after it was concluded, Nova did an extraordinary 2-hour program about the trial, and I thought I would let you see a little clip from that.
On Nova.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
It's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
Nova reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turn, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial.
Now, I hope that narration was dramatic enough for you. I discovered afterwards that TV people call that the end of the world narration. Or better yet, the Super Bowl narration. I hope some of you saw this program. If not, you can watch it live on streaming video from the Novo website. And it won the Peabody Award for broadcast journalism, which is sort of the journalism's equivalent of the Oscar. In addition to the courageous teachers and the even more courageous parents who filed that lawsuit, there was an extraordinary group of expert witnesses involved in this trial that I was very privileged to be part of, and they include a number of names and faces that I'm sure are familiar to most of the people in this room, including Rob Pennock, who's the former president of the SSE, and Kevin Padian, who is shown here talking because I've always been unable to get a picture of Kevin when he wasn't talking. But in addition, they include people like the incomparable Barbara Forrest, who's the person who really dug up all the dirt on how intelligent design as a strategy had been put together. And that really was the key moment of the trial. Barbara was the real star and the story of the trial from my point of view. Now, I haven't told you what happened. On the very last day of the trial actually ended early in November. The judge took about 6 weeks to write his decision. This is the day it was announced. That's actually the NBC TV courtroom sketch of my testimony in the trial. But I have to tell you something because it's extraordinary. The last day of the trial, you know how if you watch trials on TV, both attorneys get to make closing statements. Well, the attorney for the school board got up there and he sort of fumbled with his calendar. Nobody knew what he was doing. And then he looked up to the judge and he said, "Your Honor, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but this trial has lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the judge very sternly looked down from the bench, leaned up on his elbows and said, "But it wasn't by design." And at that point, we were pretty sure how things were going to come out. But we had to wait for that decision, and it was a great Christmas present. It was extraordinary. He simply said, "This stuff is not science." This was reported front page news in newspapers all over the country. It was featured on the nightly news of all the major networks that night, and it set off rejoicing among the parents in Dover who had filed the lawsuit. It's very important to remember that it was the parents of students in the school who objected to this policy, and they were ultimately vindicated. Well, I'd like to say, finally, they had their day in court, so surely now the battle is truly over. But it turns out it's not. The evolution battle simply is not finished. The top grossing documentary film, no kidding, of 2009 was a movie called Expelled. It was hosted by Ben Stein, and it is an anti-evolution diatribe that places responsibility for 6 million deaths during the Nazi Holocaust squarely on the shoulders of, yes, Charles Darwin. And if you think that's improbable, you have to watch the film. The reality is the evolution battle isn't finished. Secondly, and I'm trying to make this point as fervently as I can to our colleagues in other branches of science, it's not about evolution. It really is about an attack on scientific reason itself. And that is what is at stake. And finally, it matters, I think it really matters, for the future of science in the United States. Let me give you an example. This is a chart that some of you may have seen before. This is one of these things you should never show. If you're a grad student, never show a slide like this in a room this big, because nobody can read what's on it. But what you have here are polls of about 1,000 citizens in 33 advanced industrialized countries, and they were asked, do you accept evolution or not? If you said yes, you're in the blue. If you said no, you're in red. And if you weren't sure, you're in the color in between. Now, I know you can't read it. At the very top are Scandinavian countries. Iceland and Sweden came out right on top. You probably can't find the United States on this chart because it's too blurry, so I'm going to help you. The United States is right there. The only country in the poll that we beat out was Turkey. Now, I found this significant when this was published in the journal Science for a number of reasons, but as it turns out, at the time we had 2 Turkish graduate students in our graduate program in molecular and cellular biology at Brown. They're both great kids. They've since gotten their PhDs. They're going on to great scientific careers. But as I was in my lab reading this, one of them was walking down the hallway, and I said, Erkan, come here, you got to see this, man. So I show this to him, he reads the article, and he gets to the page with this picture, and he holds his head in his hands, and he says, "I'm so ashamed." And I said, "Surely it's not that bad." He goes, "Look at that, we couldn't even beat the United States." And unfortunately, that says something. And my big concern for this country, and I know this is an international meeting, so this is a parochial interest, but my big concern for this country is that if we raise up a generation of young people who have been taught to be hostile and suspicious and distrustful of science, then what will happen is that the scientific enterprise will be a country which has been, I think, the international haven for world scientific research in a way that will not just be bad for science, but will be bad for the United States of America. And that's my reason for concern about this. Now, the interesting thing, as I mentioned, creationism is a public relations success story, certainly in the United States, but it's an admitted scientific failure. I have a photograph up here of the gentleman who really is, everyone would agree, the intellectual inspiration of the intelligent design movement. In academic circles, I like to say that intelligent design, like a lot of really bad ideas, came out of the campus of the University of California at Berkeley. And the reason for that is intelligent design as a strategy was hatched by Philip Johnson, who's now a retired professor of law at Cal Berkeley. But significantly, right after the Dover trial, he gave an interview to a science publication on the Berkeley campus. And what he said here was extraordinary. He said, "I don't really think there is a theory of intelligent design right now that's a comparable alternative to the Darwinian theory." Now, he doesn't think evolution is right, but he says there's no intelligent design theory that's comparable. And he makes it clear that he thinks the scientific people in the ID movement have let him down. And he said no product is ready for competition in the educational world. So I tell parents when I speak to them, and especially teachers, that if someone comes to you and says, "Why don't we teach intelligent design in our schools? Why don't we have both sides of the story?" Point to what Philip Johnson said. We got nothing. He admitted that there is simply no science to go along with the idea of intelligent design, and he's the guy who spearheaded the intelligent design movement. Nonetheless, what Time magazine once called the evolution wars continue. Everybody's favorite example of this, in part because the process is so open and so public and so easy to follow, is the great state of Texas. Texas, a few years ago, had hearings on new science standards. They voted on some standards whose wording challenges the theory of evolution in interesting ways. They question evolution as a process, the nature of the fossil record, and so forth. But I should tell you, Texas is not alone. In just this year, 7 states have considered anti-evolution laws in their state legislatures. None of these has passed to the point where it's a matter of concern, but it shows that anti-evolution activity is everywhere, that it's alive and well. If you live in the Midwest, you may know about the $27 million Creation Museum in northern Kentucky, not too far from Cincinnati. It's been a financial success. It has drawn thousands of visitors, many of them school kids, from all over the area, and it's been so successful that its organizers now plan to build a Noah's Ark theme park. And to my absolute amazement, this Noah's Ark theme park, which is in the planning stages, but it's the final planning stages, has won the support of the state government in Kentucky. This tells you that we still have a long way to go to educate people about science and the nature of the scientific method. Now, when I look at some of the arguments that are raised against evolution, I'm always struck by something, and that is that to a great extent, the business of casting doubt on evolution, and I really regard it as a business, seems to think that evolutionary theory has been unchanged since 1859, because essentially their arguments are focused on Darwin himself. And indeed, it's true that evolutionary theory started simple. And the essence of Darwin's ideas in The Origin of Species are extraordinarily straightforward, and these are almost chapter titles in The Origin, if you know the book well. First of all, variation exists among natural populations. Secondly, every year many more offspring are born than can possibly survive to maturity. As a result of those two verifiable things, there is within each species a struggle for existence, and characteristics that are beneficial in that struggle for existence are going to become more common in a population that will change the characteristics of a species, and over time that can lead to the emergence of new species. So that's the simple essence of evolution and evolutionary theory. But evolution, as we all know, hasn't stayed simple. Evolution has emerged from a theory of origins to something that really encompasses almost every aspect of the life sciences. I was privileged 2 years ago to speak at a gathering of what you might call molecular evolutionists. Some of you were probably there, in Cold Spring Harbor. This was an amazing conference, and it gave anyone who was there a chance to see the way in which evolutionary thinking now influences the level of molecular biology, genomics, proteomics, and so forth. It was extraordinary stuff. And one night, over a few drinks after several very good talks at that conference, a colleague of mine said, you know, here's the problem. And the problem that we have is the narrative that exists in opposition to evolution. And basically, what the guy said was, how can we compete with a compelling narrative like creation? How do we deal with a narrative that is so compelling that people just want to believe it? And I'm going to try to answer that in the time that I have left. My first answer is going to come from literature, and my second answer is going to come from Stephen Jay Gould. So here's my answer for literature. And you may recognize the picture of Salman Rushdie, the distinguished author. Only this year did I get around to reading what Rushdie himself described as a children's book once, which is a sea of stories. And when I was reconsidering that book on my way out here, I thought, man, I gotta tell people, you gotta read this book. This is an extraordinary book. It's a light read and it's great fun. Now, what happens in the book is that Khatam Shud, described as the Prince of Silence, has begun to poison the sea of stories, the wellspring from which all narratives and poems and plays actually come. So then what happens is people are concerned that very soon there will be just one story that in the darkening silence caused by Khatam Shud basically stifles storytelling by describing everything, invention and creativity. Haroun, the title character, comes to lead an expedition to foil these plans and keep the stories flowing. And needless to say, the novel has a happy ending. But beneath the subtext of that, there's a much more cogent point and a brilliant point that is made by Rushdie in this brief novel, and that is stories matter. The stories we tell ourselves shape the way in which we understand the world around us. Evolution is a story too, but it's not just a story. It's a unifying concept that brings together things from every aspect of biology. And that includes development, physiology, gene expression, natural history, proteomics, and genomics. It's not just about fossils, although evolution is surely about fossils, but as we know today, it is also about the control of positioning, the regulation of development, and the recipe for building our own bodies. These are the stories that matter, and I think for biologists, evolution is our sea of stories. It is the sea from which we must draw to explain life itself. Nobody understood this better than Stephen Jay Gould. One of the constant criticisms of evolution is always, yeah, you think evolution could produce the human body? Explain the evolution of the eye. And there's a famous passage from Charles Darwin in which he says, I freely confess that to think that the eye with all its contrivances could have evolved by this process seems absurd. Creationists love to quote that passage, but they never quote the next paragraph, because in the next paragraph Darwin explains exactly what he has in mind. Now, Gould confronted that question as much as anybody else. But interestingly, he had a way with stories. And rather than simply saying, I'm going to tackle head-on the issue of how the vertebrate eye evolved, he said, let's consider the more general case. Where do organs of extreme perfection come from? And his example was found in an essay called The Prime Mount of Fish on Its Rear. And specifically when he talked about a freshwater clam called Lampsilius. which has, and these are the drawings from his essay. That's actually a bad photograph, and here's a drawing. A clam that has what looks like a fish attached to one side of its body. That serves almost as a lure. Here is a photograph of this so you can see what it's like. And it wiggles this fish-like lure, and other fish swimming around see it, and they're drawn to it. Now, how could a structure this intricate? It's got a tail like a fish, it's got the body shape of a fish, it's got an eye spot, but it's actually part of the clam itself. How could a structure like that have evolved? And what Gould did in step-by-step fashion was to go ahead and explain the following points. First of all, movement attracts fish. Fish are always looking for things that are moving in the water. Related species also have fleshy tissues which they move back and forth that fish are drawn to as well. Now, the reason having a fish nearby is important to Lampsilus is because it has a parasitic stage in its life cycle. And when fish are drawn to the lure, Lampsilus releases its larvae, which then get caught and live for a brief period of time in the gills of the fish. So the lure has adaptive significance. And what this means is that natural selection has favored fleshy tissue of this clam that attract fish for the purposes of depositing their larvae into the fish gills, and natural selection has favored morphology that looks more and more like actual fish. In other words, what you have is a classic story of what Gould called exaptation, followed by natural selection. It's great stuff. And if you read Gould for nothing else, read him for 1,000 stories, or more like 300 stories, related to exactly this sort of thing. Exploring the diversity of the evolutionary tree of life. Now, Darwin himself appreciated all the aspects of this. And evolution is, I would argue to all of you, by any standard, a better story than any epic of creationism. It has more twists, more turns, more extraordinary and wonderful things to say, and it has an additional special advantage over creationism, and that is, it is actually true. And therefore, I think as a scientist, that matters. When we look at what we come to see today as the tree of life, I'm drawn back to the way in which Charles Darwin told stories. And he wrote, as many of you know, at near the conclusion of The Origin, that it is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank clothed with plants of many kinds, birds, various insects, and worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and dependent upon each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws operating around us. That's an extraordinary vision. And I can think of no better way to illustrate that vision than a series of remarkable paintings done by Haeckel, by the great German embryologist, illustrating the diversity and the beauty and the extraordinarily wide reach of Charles Darwin's visions. It's an amazing thing. And when I, as a biologist, and I'm sure all of you who are biologists as well, when you look at the diversity of life on Earth, you realize these are the stories that we should be telling. And we should be telling them publicly, we should be telling them more often, and we should be telling them with great enthusiasm. I'll give you an example. One of the things that I hear all the time, I hear it from school boards, in letters I get from people, and in emails, is that evolution requires transitional forms between species, and the fossil record does not provide them. What you see here is a phylogeny with missing links. This one leading from terrestrial mammals to swimming mammals, cetaceans like whales and dolphins. And at one point, Dwayne Gish, a fellow whom I debated once, actually ridiculed the idea that there could have been a half-water, half-land transitional form leading to the evolution of cetaceans. He argued that a form like that would be awkward in the water and awkward on land, and therefore would have had absolutely no chance to survive. Well, as it turns out, creationists stopped saying that about 20 years ago, when biologists, paleontologists actually first dug up transitional forms that looked remarkably like the creatures that they claimed could never have existed. And what you see here is a partial reconstruction of the skeleton of Ambulocetus natans. Those of you who remember your Latin will know that Ambulocetus means the walking whale, and natans who swims. I mean, this is an amazing thing. And since it was first discovered, other paleontologists, now knowing where to look, have put together a remarkable string of intermediates showing exactly how these animals did evolve. Now, I should tell you that I like to steal pictures from people, and this is stolen from a remarkable book by the science writer Carl Zimmer called At the Water's Edge, that I recommend to any of you, and that you might think I'm generous in making attribution, but since I can see Carl sitting in the audience, I feel I darn well better mention that. Now, I have to tell you, Carl, that I've been using that image in various talks for a long time. And a couple of years ago, I was speaking in Ohio in front of a person who's contributed a great deal to whale philology named Hans Twissen. And Hans came up to me and said, "That's a lovely picture from Zimmer's book, but it's wrong." And I thought, oh my God, I'm so humiliated. What's the problem? And he said, "The problem is you've got 5 or 6 intermediates there. That's not true. There's more like 22. And he then gave me a copy of a paper of his that makes exactly that point. Here's one of Twissen's papers. It's entitled, as you can see, Whale Origins as a Poster Child for Macroevolution. I send that out to every creationist who emails me saying that macroevolution has not been proven. They all get copies of Hans Twissen's paper. There are other responses I've thought of as well. One of them, quite frankly, comes from a former student of mine named Colin Purrington, who now teaches at Swarthmore College. Colin read my testimony in the Dover trial, and I was on the stand for almost 9 hours. And he emailed me and he said, "Ken, your testimony was very good, but your mind has got on the stand and given one sentence in testimony and sat down. And it's such a short sentence, I can put it on a bumper sticker, and I will. I'm going to mail it to you." And I had no idea what he was talking about. So 2 days later, I get an envelope in the mail. I open the envelope, and there is, in fact, a bumper sticker inside. Here it is. We have the fossils we need. And you know, I think Colin was absolutely right about that. It could have saved a lot of time if I had just showed it. Yeah. But we don't have fossils just documenting the origin of cetaceans. We have them documenting the origin of Homo sapiens as well. And to this audience, I have no need to go into detail, but I do want to mention something, and that is a couple of years ago, Kenyanthropus platyops was discovered in Africa, and Nature published a little news article about it. They showed its skull compared to a very famous skull, year 1471, which is probably a Homo habilis. And they also showed, at the time, this phylogenetic tree showing the connections between various pre-human hominins that have existed over the last 5 million years, and they showed exactly where Kenyanthropus fit in. And when I looked at that, I thought it was an interesting summary, but I had the strangest feeling, and that is that I had seen this tree before. And I couldn't imagine how I could have seen it before, because it was a new discovery. It was literally hot off the presses, and I couldn't understand it. And I figured I'd go to bed and I'd sleep on it. Well, it didn't work the first night, but the second night I woke up and I said, I know exactly where I have seen that diagram before. It's in the origin of species. And as you realize, Charles Darwin only put one illustration of the origin of species. It was to show what a fossil record would look like with all the intermediate forms recovered, and lo and behold, it was the spitting image of what you see over here, fossil record. In summary, the old guy got it right, and he got it right the first time, in terms of what evolution actually looks like. Now, I'm going to try to embarrass someone else in the audience. When making the point about human evolution, I'm often confronted with the assertion that there are still missing links that should be there that want to connect us to primate ancestors if we had any. Nick, about a year or two ago, found this systematic paper in the literature talking about hominin brain sizes. And to be perfectly honest, and I cast no aspersions on the authors of this study, which I'm sure was very well done, I found the paper itself to be a little boring, because most of it is simply table after table after table of skulls, brain sizes, dates, and so forth and so on. But what Nick had the genius to realize is that there was a pearl of great price in the middle of all of this data. So what he did was to take it and plot it out on an Excel spreadsheet in terms of time before present and cranial capacity. And what happens when you do this is that the data shout at you. that what we have is an evolutionary transition from our pre-human ancestors, and the notion that there somehow is an unbridgeable gap between human and non-human primates simply falls by the wayside as a consequence of the data. Now, I'm not really a fossil person, I'm not qualified to evaluate that data, but I am kind of an RNA and DNA guy, and there's more. And this also concerns human origins. Just 2 weeks before the Dover trial began, Nature published the DNA sequence of the chimpanzee genome, and the news article accompanying it correctly summarized the fact that modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed the predictions of Darwin and Huxley that we share recent ancestors with the great apes. And I'll get to something that was in this issue of Nature in just a moment. But there's something, because I have to teach embryology when I teach introductory biology at my university, there's something that's always struck me. And that is that the embryos of placental mammals, like us, carry a yolk sac. But as I'm often at pains to point out when I lecture, I used to draw this on the blackboard. Remember blackboards when I lecture? That yolk sac in placental mammals is absolutely, totally, and completely empty. So if there's an empty yolk sac, even though those cells turn out to be of some use, why does the embryo form a sac at all? I was always asked that by students. And I would always say, well, it's a pretty simple answer. And that is because we mammals, we placentals, are evolved from animals that had yolk-containing eggs, and they really did have to form a yolk sac in order to do that. And when we went to another mode of nutrition, the instructions to form that yolk sac, albeit an empty one, were still there. But here's the cool thing that's happened in recent years. Here's the insight. If the ancestors of mammals once had eggs that had lots of yolk in them, then that means the mammalian genome once had genes for the yolk protein, vitellogenin. Is it possible that those genes are still lurking in there, in the human genome somewhere, confirming our own evolutionary history? Well, as it turns out, the answer is yes. The human genome actually contains 3 vitellogenin genes. We have non-functional remnants of all 3 of these genes of the same type that are found in birds, which of course use all 3 of them. And when they are traced phylogenetically, you end up, and you see the reference down here, you end up with a chart like this. And what it tells you is that in us mammals, VIT1 and VIT3 were lost first, and VIT2 was lost about 70 million years ago. Egg-laying mammals retain 1 functional vitellogenin gene. And here's the interesting thing about this. When you use a molecular clock to estimate the times at which this happens, the loss of the vitellogenin genes parallels the appearance of the casein genes and the evolution of the mammalian placenta. In short, it's a story from separate lines of evidence that fits together absolutely brilliantly. Gould knew the importance of this kind of story, although he did not live to see this piece of research. He wrote about it in an essay called The Senseless Signs of History. It makes no sense that we should have remnants of the vitellogenin gene in our genome. But here are Gould's words. Darwin reasoned, if organisms have a history, then ancestral stages should leave remnants behind. Remnants of the past that don't make sense in present terms. The useless, the odd, the peculiar, the incongruous are the signs of history. They supply proof that the world was not made in its present form. When history perfects, it covers its own tracks. It does indeed. My favorite example comes from the fact that we humans carry 46 chromosomes. All of the other great apes, without exceptions, carry 48. Being biologists, you know, those are, in us, actually 23 pairs of chromosomes. We get 23 pairs from mom and 23 pairs from dad. Why are we missing a pair of chromosomes? Well, the only answer that makes sense in evolutionary terms is that in one of our direct ancestors, 2 chromosomes that are still separate in the other primates got fused together to form a single chromosome in us. That would drop us from 24 pairs down to 23. But here's the reason why evolution is science and not conjecture. That is a testable prediction. If that really happened, somewhere in the human genome, we carry around a fused chromosome. Now, how would you find that chromosome? Biologists, especially a cell biologist, knows that that's pretty easy. The tips of every chromosome carry a unique sequence, highly repetitive DNA, on their telomeres. there also are recognizable sequences at the centromere of chromosomes. If one of our chromosomes was formed by the fusion of two separate chromosomes in the recent past, that chromosome should have two centromeres, and it should have telomere DNA where it doesn't belong in the center of the chromosome. That's a testable prediction. If we look at our genome and we don't find a chromosome like that, then the argument of common ancestry is on very thin ice. But if we do, it's a powerful and specific confirmation of a prediction made by the doctrine, the idea of common ancestry. Well, many of you know this story, but for those of you who don't, I will save you the suspense. It's chromosome number 2. Human chromosome number 2 has two centromeres on it. One is active, one is not. They correspond to what we used to call primate chromosomes 12 and 13. These now are called, in chimpanzee and gorilla genomics, 2A and 2B, because they correspond to the two halves of human chromosome 2A and 2B, and the telomere DNA is right there, and we even know the exact base at which the fusion occurred. This is extraordinary stuff. When I've spoken in front of creationist audiences about this, they struggle to find a way to explain this data away, because you really can't. Their most common explanation is this couldn't have happened. That a fusion between chromosomes would be lethal, would be fatal, there's no selective advantage, and so forth and so on. And the easiest way to answer that is with a story about more biology. Do chromosome fusions happen in other species? Well, these species, which is, as far as I can tell, the mammalian world champion for chromosome fusions, is the mouse. And there's a wonderful study on the island of Madeira, where mice were introduced only about 500 years ago, that shows that in addition to the common diploid number of most mice, a 40 chromosome, there are races on the island in isolated pockets which have 28, 24, and even 22 pairs of chromosomes, all caused by fusions of the same sort that we saw in our own ancestry. But it gets better than that. There's another study about horses. And for those of you who live in cities and stuff like that, I want to show you what a horse looks like. The horse is the one on the right. And this is Remy, our 5-year-old gelding, back in our farm in Massachusetts. I actually haven't karyotyped Remy, but I'm pretty sure he's got 64 chromosomes, because that's what all domestic horses have. Those of you who know the genetics of wild horses, however, such as the Mongolian wild horse, know that Mongolian wild horses actually have 66 chromosomes. But all domesticated horses have 64. What happened to their pair of chromosomes? You want to know? Same story as in us, which is a fusion occurred between, in Przewalski's horse, between chromosome 23 and 24 to form what is in the domestic horse chromosome number 5. This sort of chromosome fusion didn't just happen in us, it happened in lots of organisms. In our genome, it's what Gould called a senseless sign of history that makes perfectly good sense. Now, one of the things that I hear from time to time is the question of design. And I'm told repeatedly by people who are uneasy about evolution, look at the design of this protein, or this pathway, or the human body. Surely that reflects the work of an intelligence operating outside of nature. So I want to answer directly, I want to give you directly the answer I always give when people say they think that life has a design. And my answer to that is, yes, it does. In cell biology and biochemistry, we talk about the design of proteins, the design of signaling pathways. And what we mean by design is the correlation between structure and function, between biochemistry and chemical reaction. There is indeed a design to life, but it's the design of evolution. It's the design that results from the evolutionary process and from the laws of physics and chemistry that make all of this possible. And I want to be specific about this. That design extends to the human body. Once, more than 200 years ago, Reverend William Paley wrote a marvelous book called Natural Theology. For anyone who hasn't read it, I urge you to read it. Paley was an extraordinary biologist. He really was a very sophisticated guy. He could think, however, of no explanation for the elegant design of not just the human body, but the bodies of other organisms, other than divine creation. But you cannot read natural theology without coming away with admiration for how much Paley knew about anatomy and physiology. And I can wager that if William Paley walked the earth today and picked up a copy of The Origin of Species, he'd be an evolutionist in a flash, because he understood full well so much about physiology would have led him to it directly. But I want to confirm something that Paley said, and that is that there is a design to the human body. But it's not the one he thought, it's the one that Neil Shubin told us about in his extraordinary book, Your Inner Fish. As Neil explains, and I hope you've all read this book, and if you haven't, shame on you, go out and read it. It is a great book. And it will explain to you that all of us carry around an anatomy that is actually a modified fish body plan. And in this, Neil tries to explain things like why we hiccup, no kidding, where breasts come from, where hair comes from. All of these things can be answered by going back to our fishy, to our Piscean ancestry. That's the design in the human body. And that design extends not just to the human body, but to everything else in biology. When Joe Levine and I have sat down to revise and to write our textbooks, we realize that as well. And our textbooks have, as you heard earlier, an evolutionary theme. And it's an evolutionary theme that runs through every page of the book. Now, if you doubt that, if you're not sure that the textbook really does that, I want to bring up an authority to testify. And the authority in this case is him, the chair of the textbook selection committee of the Dover, Pennsylvania Board of Education. And in this clip, which appeared on a local news station, he explains why he objected to our book being used in the classroom in Dover. Listen carefully.
The book that was presented to me for biology was laced with Darwinism from the beginning to the end.
Laced with Darwinism from the beginning to the end. I called up my co-author, Joe Levine. I played that audio clip for him. I said, Joe, what do you think about that? His answer was, best endorsement. And in truth, as Dobzhansky once said, nothing in biology makes sense, nothing, except in the light of evolution. And Dobzhansky, of course, was absolutely, totally, and completely right. This is a diagram of all the aspects of evolution, a summary diagram from a college textbook, and it's extraordinary stuff. And evolution pervades everything in biology, and I think we are right to tell mechanistic stories of how important evolution is in understanding physiology, in understanding genetics, in understanding the balance in ecosystems and so forth. But I hope when we do that, we never lose sight of the way in which Stephen Jay Gould used to tell stories. You cannot read any of Gould's essays, no matter how erudite, how intricate, and how complicated they are, without coming away with an appreciation for the absolute delight that he took in life itself, the way in which he explored the beauty, the intricacy, all the extraordinary treasures that evolution has given us. And as we look around the world today, I want to urge each and every one of you to get involved. Now, I don't mean you have to run for school board. I don't mean you have to show up in public meetings or write op-ed pieces. But I think each of us in our universities can be advocates for effective science education, and especially for evolution itself as the unifying principle in all of the life sciences. All of the diversity of this planet has been driven, the biological diversity, by the process of evolution. We should never forget that, and we should never cease to have the twinkle in our eyes when we tell other people about it. When I'm asked myself, and I'm asked all this all the time by people, don't you find evolution depressing or demeaning or degrading? Doesn't it bum you out that you are just an animal, or that you arose by the operations of natural laws on lifeless chemical and physical entities? My always answer is no. I think it's kind of cool to think that we as a species are brought up in a fabric of life that covers this entire planet, and that we have a rich history and a rich heritage that extends to kinship with every other living thing. But no matter how hard I try, I can't express that idea as well as the guy who made this sketch in his notebook more than 150 years ago. And I'll bet you everybody in this room knows this notebook page. And I always delight in looking at it, because what he wrote was, I think And then he made a sketch, a kind of sketch that no one had ever made before. And he wrote some explanatory notes down here in just awful handwriting, very hard to translate. And then a couple weeks later, he came back and he wrote more explanatory notes up there because he didn't want to lose the essence of it. And at the end of a very great book that you've all, the gentleman who kept this page in his notebook contemplated that question as to whether the evolutionary vision for life is depressing or degrading and so forth. And he obviously thought it wasn't. He said to the contrary, I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That is, of course, the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And ladies and gentlemen, I think those are words to live by. Thank you very much.